13 months ago. While it looks likely the ban will be extended beyond June, Australia will have to open up at some stage. The question is, when?
Where an Australian is vaccinated under our program, when they will be able to travel overseas, that could be done and return to Australia without the need for a hotel quarantine.
Returning Australians, if vaccinated, would then be able to quarantine at home. It's the first glimpse we've had into how international travel could operate in the near future. But it may be premature, with the PM's plans at odds with what his own health minister said just days prior.
If the whole country were vaccinated, you couldn't just open the borders.
The hotel quarantine system has been Australia's best defence against COVID-19.
Again, a day of no community transmission and no deaths.
While the thought of being locked in a hotel like this for 14 days may seem less than ideal, overwhelmingly, Australians have been embracing it.
In Australia, we have a more utilitarian relationship with incarceration, particularly for these sorts of issues. We seem to be more comfortable with the idea that people should forego their personal liberty for the greater good.
However, Australia's travel ban has been criticised in some quarters. The right-wing group Liberty Works is taking the federal government to court to reverse the ban.
The health minister cannot subject a group of individuals, via determination, to a measure of a kind to which the chief medical officer could subject an individual via a biosecurity control order.
But the government disagrees.
The overseas travel restriction imposed by the determination is not a measure that requires an individual to be subject to a biosecurity measure of the relevant kind. Rather, it is of broad application, applying to all Australian citizens and permanent residents.
The Coalition warns the case threatens to undermine the emergency biosecurity laws which have kept Australia safe.
And that report there looking at the changes we can anticipate. Adam Hills, I want to bring you in. You've actually just survived. You're a survivor of hotel quarantine. In fact, I think you've done it a couple of times now. Obviously, this idea is being floated on the premise of a highly, high vaccinated Australia. Do you think it's a good idea that if you're vaccinated, you would quarantine at home?
I mean, it would certainly make my life a lot easier, and a lot of Australians around the world, because people can't get home because they can't afford the flights, and they can't afford the flights because there's only a certain number of hotel quarantine rooms available. So it would make life a lot easier for a lot of people. But, I mean, in England at the moment, there's still a lot of cases of COVID, but there are very, very few deaths because it turns out anyone who's in danger of dying from COVID has been vaccinated. So my question would be, is it better to vaccinate the people coming into Australia, or is it better to vaccinate the people who are vulnerable in Australia? That way, it doesn't matter if someone's bringing COVID in. You're elderly and the people who are disabled are now vaccinated. I don't know the answer to that, but that's the question I'd like to know.
Tasneem, obviously the Prime Minister is floating this because we're getting to the next phase, or at least planning for the next phase. We presumably can't have closed borders forever, many Australians stranded, but also many desperate to actually go overseas, not just for holidays, but many diaspora communities wanting to reunite with family. There are many good reasons to want to go overseas. Is it time to be having this discussion about the next phase of our quarantine program?
Look, as a Victorian, who endured probably the longest lockdown of any state in the country, the advice from, I guess, the health sector and the health department is pretty much what guided the decisions that were made by the leadership here. And so my inclination would be whatever the health sector and whatever the health professionals, including people like Raina, are saying on this issue, that's where the guidance should be taking. And while there is definitely an imperative of families being reunited and that need to be with ones that we love and see greener pastures, etc., I don't know if that actually necessarily warrants, putting people's health at risk. So it's weighing it out, really. It's weighing it out, but taking advice from the experts in the field as opposed to pundits and lobbyists and those who maybe the government might be inclined to listen to for the wrong reasons.
Well, you mentioned our specialist. We've got her in the studio to talk to us. For more on this, we're joined by the head of Global Biosecurity at the Kirby Institute at the University of New South Wales, Raina McIntyre. Raina, lovely to be joined by you. What do you make of what the Prime Minister is now floating? People who are vaccinated being able to home quarantine?
I think it depends on which vaccine to some extent, because there is a difference in efficacy of vaccines and a difference in whether vaccines can stop transmission. So what you don't want is someone coming in with one of these new variants who's vaccinated, doesn't get severely ill, but still transmits the infection to their family members. I think home quarantine is a risk. If you recall, at about this time last year, or a couple of, February, March 2020, we did have home quarantine and it was failing, and we had that first wave because people were breaching the quarantine, and that's why we moved to hotel quarantine. I think the hotel quarantine really is a very important part of the COVID-free existence we've largely been able to have in Australia.
So the vaccine matters, the kind of vaccine people have had. Will the government be able to be that specific, Raina McIntyre, to say, well, you've had Pfizer, so you can come in, or, you've only had AstraZeneca, so you need to hotel quarantine?
Well, I think we don't have the data at this stage. There's only very preliminary data from places like Israel, for example, from the UK, Scotland, etc., on the experience with different vaccines. But certainly from the clinical trials there and from some of the post-licensure data, there is still the possibility that some people who are vaccinated can transmit the virus. So I think further down the track, we'll definitely see differentiation based on which vaccine you got. At this stage, probably there's not enough data to do that, but...
You mentioned the failures of our previous home quarantine system. That's why we have hotel quarantine, right? We remember them, people going, I could just go to the sneaky supermarket run, I really need some milk, it'll be okay, and then whoopsie-daisy, didn't work out so well. Would it be, ankle bracelets, the idea of having another kind of monitoring system built into this? Could that be a way to do it?
I just think the hotel quarantine is the best way. We did figure out a good way to do it. I think there's other ways in which we could bring all the stranded Australians back. We could, have charter flights and set up purposeful quarantine centres, a bit like Christmas Island was used for the people coming from Wuhan in early last year. There's other solutions. Other than home quarantine. Most people will do the right thing in home quarantine, but there's always that percentage who won't. And the risk is that there's so much COVID still in the rest of the world. And just remember that first wave that we saw in Australia where it was coming in from overseas. That's the kind of scenario we'd face, but there's a greater risk of it now because there's much more COVID in the world now than there was a year ago.
So based on what we're seeing now, be frank with us, when do you think realistically we're going to see the international borders open if we're seeing these new strains as you talk about and the global situation where clearly not everyone is vaccinated?
Well, I don't know because the decision may not be made on a disease control basis. It may be made on another basis. I don't know.
But if it's on a disease control basis, we're talking about a long period of hard borders, aren't we?
I think we've really got another 12 months of this because of the delays and problems with the vaccine rollout. We're really looking at quite an extended delay till most people are vaccinated. On top of that, there's, of course, the issue of children who comprise, about 20% of the population. And at this stage, without clinical trial data, we can't vaccinate children. Those data will come. But that will be the last group of people to be vaccinated, and that'll be, well into next year, hopefully.
Toby, we've become a country that's rather accustomed to 0 days, donut days. We love a donut day, we have them all the time, and they're happy days for us. We love living in this island of no transmission, but the Prime Minister today warned that the premature removal of border restrictions could result in 1,000 cases a week. Are we psychologically prepared for that sort of thing? If it's inevitable that we're going to see transmission if we open up borders, do you think people will wear it?
No, I don't think they will. They'll wear a certain number, but if it's going to be 1,000 a week, it'll be a disaster. And I think people would rather put up with the strictures we're dealing with today than become like the rest of the world. Australia's been, you know, blissfully successful in fending off the pandemic, really. And if it really started taking off on an American or British scale, I think we'd be in all sorts of trouble and people would resent it deeply after what's been done so far. So no, we're not ready for it, I don't think.
So Jackie, the idea that the Prime Minister has floated, he's trying to warm us up to something, I feel, right? Is it reasonable that people come home and quarantine if they've been vaccinated, even if there is some risk?
There are a lot of steps between now and opening our borders, and the federal government has a lot to do with coordinating the state's response at this point. I don't believe that Australians want to see a state-by-state approach to this international opening of borders, and the government in this particular instance has that critical role between the international countries' relationships as well as the coordination of the states to make sure that this is a response that all the premiers can get behind. And to say that we are going to open borders, I think goes back to this, I mean, it's our desperate desire, but the practical measures that we need to take from there are many. And so having that discussion now seems a little premature to me.
So, Raina McIntyre, do you think this idea of having people home quarantine, you mentioned 12 months for international borders to open. Do you think that if we were to have people home quarantining who went overseas or came back from overseas within the next 12 months, that would be too big a risk?
I think so. And the reason is there's much more COVID around now than there was at the time of our first wave in the rest of the world. And we've got all the variants of concern that are more transmissible, more lethal. And with a population that's largely unvaccinated, that's a big risk.
Adam,
and the other point is,
please.
that you can't negotiate with the virus and say, I'll take 1,000 a week, thanks. That's not how it works. The virus increases exponentially. So, you know, it's 1,000 one week, it'll be 3,000 the next week, and, you know, 9,000 the week after that. So you can't just say, I'll take this level, thanks, and expect that's how, you can't just determine what level you want.
Is there any tolerable level? Because as I say, we're donut people now. Is there going to be any risk that we're prepared to take?
Well, we have seen cases of COVID coming in from overseas in people who are in hotel quarantine, and I think that's an acceptable level. But
that's because they're not mixing the community. If they were at home, you're saying that's risky.
That's right. That's right. It's not a chronic disease like asthma or diabetes. You can't just say, I'll take this much, thanks. It's an epidemic disease, which means one case leads to 3 other cases, lead to 9 other cases. It grows exponentially. So you can't just have a constant level of disease, you know, just because you want it.
So thumbs down from you on the Prime Minister's idea at this stage. Do you think that the science doesn't stack up, that it's too big a risk?
I think you just have to look at Victoria, you know. At the peak of that, we were having around 750 cases a day, and that was pretty bad for people living in Victoria. So...
yeah, look, it wasn't fun.
You know, in the end, the health system is the weak point in any society, because when the health system can't cope, it collapses, and it reaches capacity. It can't do any more, and then lockdowns happen. We've seen that happen all over the world. In Chile, actually, they started vaccinating in December and got all enthusiastic and opened everything up before everyone was vaccinated, and they're having a massive third wave now.
Adam, you mentioned before that, you know, you would like to quarantine at home, but now I think Raina McIntyre's probably might have changed your desire to do that, because I suspect that you're a man who believes in the science too, or what the experts say. But what that means is that, no offence, I like you very much, but privileged people like you will have an advantage at coming home, right?
Yeah, I mean, that is the major flaw in the system at the moment, is that it's if you've got the money, then you can make it back home. And not just the money for the flight. I'm not getting any special treatment. I go like every other Aussie online, try and find a flight back to Australia. They are ridiculously expensive. and they're likely to be cancelled. And when that flight's cancelled, you need to have the money up your sleeve to book another flight while you're waiting for the money to come back from that first flight. So this trip back that I just took like a month ago, I think I had 4 flights cancelled before I managed to find one back to Australia and then have to pay the quarantine as well. So unfortunately, the system at the moment is basically saying if you've got lots of money, you can come home. It's as simple as that. And it's not a fair system. I don't know what the answer is. And as you know, Raina is the expert, and she has said maybe more charter flights and more kind of places that people can quarantine to allow more Australians to come home. But yeah, unfortunately at the moment, the system is unfair. The system is if you can afford a flight and afford another and another and another and hope one of them doesn't get cancelled, then you can come home.
Well, we also heard today that the federal government is considering whether to prioritise vaccinating Australian athletes and support staff before they head off to the Tokyo Olympics. Japan is currently experiencing its 4th wave of the virus, and there have been suggestions that the Games could be cancelled again.
I think the health and welfare of our athletes is paramount. Having said that, you know, I think we have to hope for the best and plan for the worst. So we're really planning that the athletes won't be vaccinated, and ultimately there'll be strict protocols working with the Australian Olympic Committee in place, not only in our staging camp in Cairns, but obviously in Tokyo, and trying to create as much of a bubble as we can at the village and at the pool as well.
So, Jackie, we love a bit of gold in this country, right? Like, we do love sport, we love medals. We clearly want to send our Olympic team. Should they be going to the front of the queue to get vaccinated?
Given we are increasing the rollout of the vaccine at the moment, there is a very strong case in my mind to have these athletes vaccinated. As you say, it's a cultural touch point for us. The Olympics is a really great way for the country to come together, to cheer on our athletes, to feel a sense of joy and to find a sense of normalcy, I suppose, after all of this COVID lockdown. And unfortunately, Japan is experiencing a much worse outbreak of COVID than we are. And it would be important, I believe, for those athletes, for their health and safety, to be vaccinated to attend.
Tasneem, there's no doubt Australians love sport. Like, anyone can fact check that, go crazy. It's a fact, right? People just look at, you know, the numbers of people turning up to things. But equally, Australians don't like queue jumping, right? Can I be blunt? How is that going to look? How can you sell that? Oh, we're putting them at the front of the queue. Do you think people will just wear it, or is it going to be a problem?
I think pockets of the community will embrace it, because they are, you know, sporting is religion, as you said, in this country to a large extent. But I mean, as the point you made earlier about privilege, I mean, how fortuitous that if you're an Olympian, that you get fast tracked, literally, to get this golden ticket out of here. Presumably, you'd have to quarantine though for 2 weeks when you got back, depending on where that lands. But I mean, the bigger question is how safe is Japan? And if the argument the government has been touting to this point of why we're not reopening borders yet, or why we're not, you know, allowing excess travel because safety matters first, where's the consistency in that argument when discussing the Olympians? So, you know, you can't have it both ways, and I think that lack of consistency is what will catch them out.
Raina McIntyre, what's your view on this? Is it, you know, if we're sending our Olympic team and we've made that decision to Japan, we also have an obligation, don't we, to ensure that they're safe?
Yes, if the decision is made that they're going, then they should be vaccinated, because not only is Japan having a bad epidemic, they also have this novel variant that's arisen in Japan, which is very similar to the Brazilian variant, the P1 strain. It's almost identical, and we really wouldn't want any of them becoming infected with that or bringing it back to Australia.
Toby, should we then, given what we're hearing about what's going on in Japan and a 4th wave, be thinking twice about sending our team?
We should be thinking 3 times about it.
Three times?
We should rename them the cluster games. And this is going to be a complete disaster for the world. I've got a brother who's a professor in Tokyo, and only 30% of Japanese support the Olympics going ahead. They all think it's a disaster there, but they left the decision to the people who make the money out of it. And so they said, yes, let's go ahead. It's going to be dreadful. I think morally we shouldn't be vaccinating our athletes. I think pragmatically we should, because people love us, you know, watching Australians struggle in fifth in a race on telly. So we should probably shove them to the front of the queue and send them off and leave them in quarantine for a while. But honestly, were the decision mine, I'd be saying, let's not go. Let's set an example to the world that these bloody things shouldn't go ahead.
Wow. I wonder if that's likely to happen. I suspect not, Adam Hills. I think we're pretty keen, actually, on sending our team. What do you think? Do you think we should think, what, 3 times, 4 times?
I think it's kind of a trade-off. I think all of the sporting events that have taken place over the last 12 months have been so good for public mental health in a weird way. People have needed something to cling on to, and to have, whether it's rugby league or Aussie rules or whatever, the tennis go ahead, it gives people something to look forward to while they're going through lockdown. But then you're exactly right. Like, where do we stand in this country? Do we go, oh, okay, if you've got a possible gold medalist there and your grandmother there and you have to choose who to vaccinate first, who are you going to vaccinate first? I think if it's made that simple, I think it has to be your grandmother.
Yeah, I think we're all going to agree on that. I think grandma's first. Thank you so much, Raina. Raina McIntyre is the head of Global Biosecurity at the Kirby Institute at the University of New South Wales. You're watching The Drum, and with me on the panel is Senior Account Manager for communications firm Agenda C, Jackie Munro. In Adelaide, marketing strategist Toby Ralph. And in Melbourne, comedian Adam Hills. Also in Melbourne, cross-cultural consultant Tasneem Chopra. Now, what connects Will Smith, COCA-COLA and Major League Baseball? Well, it's all got something to do with new voting laws in the US state of Georgia. Major League Baseball has pulled its lucrative All-Star game from the state, and Will Smith's slavery film Emancipation has stopped filming there over what the star has labelled new regressive voting laws. Corporate giants like Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines have also publicly criticised the laws brought in by the Republican legislature, which curtail early voting and require people to present photo ID to lodge votes by mail. Now, Georgia played a crucial role in the last election when the traditionally red state turned blue, and opponents of the new laws say they make it harder for people of colour to have their say at the ballot box. The Drum's Eliza Harvey has more.
Before the attack on the US Capitol building, Donald Trump was already revving up the crowd with claims of a stolen election.
You can't ever accept when they steal and rig and rob. Can't accept.
And when it was becoming harder to deny the loss, he pressured Georgia's Secretary of State to change the outcome.
We have won this election in Georgia. The people of Georgia are angry. The people of the country are angry. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
As the faith that beats...
The results stood, and Donald Trump conceded defeat. But 4 months later, Georgia's legislature has introduced new laws which critics argue will further disenfranchise voters of colour. The laws restrict absentee ballots and mail-in voting, and even limit the food and water that can be given to people waiting in line.
The best way to deal with this is for Georgia and other states to smarten up. Stop it. Stop it.
Voting rights activists called on big corporates to mount a protest. Major League Baseball was the first to move, pulling out of the state and moving its lucrative All-Star game to Colorado. And tensions rose.
Yesterday, Major League Baseball caved to fear and lies from liberal activists. They ignored the facts of our new election integrity law, and they ignored the consequences of their decision on our local community.
And then Coca-Cola, one of the biggest employers in Georgia, followed suit.
This legislation is unacceptable. It is a step backwards, and it does not promote principles we have stood for in Georgia around broad access to voting.
At this point, Donald Trump weighed in again. In a statement on his website, he accused the left of going big time with woke cancel culture and our sacred elections. He called on supporters to boycott Major League Baseball, COCA-COLA, Delta Airlines and others. A few hours later, the former president was photographed with a Coke bottle on his desk, which was posted on Twitter by his aide, Stephen Miller. But the new laws stand in Georgia, in a state where just 12,500 voters helped secure the Democrats' path to power.
Toby, I want to bring you in here.
Sure.
Is it fair enough that corporations who have a strong view about a social issue, in this case a pretty significant, important issue, which is voting rights, can have their say?
I think in this particular issue in voting rights, yes, it's correct for corporations to do it because it affects their staff and their customers very directly. I think, however, there's a big trend with CEOs and corporations to weigh into social policies when, in fact, the business of business is business. And really, the stakeholders involved in a particular issue, in my opinion, should be the people who have a significant say rather than soap powders and deodorants.
So give me some examples of where you think they've overreached.
Well, let me give you an example where I agreed and most of the country agreed. Alan Joyce, like me, was a strong supporter of same-sex marriage. He then committed his company Qantas and its millions of travellers and shareholders and employees to support same-sex marriage. And nobody really shrugged because 67% of the country said that's a good thing, as I did. But 37% didn't agree. And he was speaking on their behalf. And he was mustering their money to fight a case. Imagine had it been the converse. Imagine Margaret Court had been the CEO of Qantas and she said, no, my position, my passion is to stop this. There would have been outrage, and there should have been outrage. Yet, you know, so corporations tend to do popular things, and CEOs very often pursue passion projects. I think I can give you other examples. If you think of, for example, of Gillette. Gillette very famously ran a campaign against toxic masculinity a little while ago. And everybody clapped. All the media thought it was wonderful. It got all sorts of praise. But their next sales quarter, their sales collapsed. And I don't think their sales collapsed because
of that ad.
Because it was because of that ad. I don't think their sales collapsed because their buyers thought that, you know, toxic masculinity is a good thing and therefore we should resist. I think most people agreed with the sentiment, but they just didn't want to be hectored by a woke razor blade. You know, it's the job of a dishwashing liquid is to get your plates clean, not to talk about refugee policy. And some people overstep the mark. People like to see the CEOs get involved, but I think they have to. Yeah, I think if a CEO wants to do that, they should use their own voice and their own money.
But let me challenge you on that. Don't CEOs reflect the public sentiment? You say if it was the, you know, converse, if the, you know, the anti-gay marriage campaign wanted to be run. Isn't it the case, though, that the public was overwhelmingly saying yes, and so there was a reflecting of the staff of Qantas, of the public mood, that actually he read the mood right beyond his own personal view?
He did. He read the mood right for 63%
and Gillette
of people.
Also read the mood right that people generally, I hope, think, you know, toxic masculinity should be a thing of the past.
But they overplayed their hand because they're a product, and a product isn't a person. You know, I want to see social policy made by thinking individuals, not by soap powders.
Okay.
You know, that's my position.
All right, Jackie, you worked on the same-sex marriage campaign. Do you think Alan Joyce made the wrong call there? Not on, you know, saying yes, but on being involved.
The same-sex marriage campaign and things like toxic masculinity, they're issues that you can have a position on. But when you have something like this Georgia situation where companies are pulling out of a state because of a particular view, it actually impacts people on the ground in Georgia in a real economic way. And for this reason, I think it's very important that corporations think about the impact of their actions. A corporation is not a person. A corporation is made up of people. Perhaps there should be a process by which a CEO can demonstrate support or otherwise for a particular view before they go out and make a song and dance about something. And the marriage equality campaign, of course, it brought on corporations very successfully. It may not always be the right approach.
But you think in that case, was that an exception for you because you feel particularly passionate about it?
It's easy for me to say that it was a good idea at the time, of course, because I was involved. But there were people that I know who felt alienated through that conversation because their views weren't being heard within their companies. So I can understand that people would feel concerned that a business is speaking on their behalf or would make them feel alienated amongst their colleagues just because their leader had a particular view that they didn't share.
Look, Tasneem, that point that was made by Toby, that it's, you know, it's all very fine when it's a view that you agree with, but when you don't, like if there's a really socially conservative boss of a company that's, you know, railing against something that you might feel a bit differently. Does that mean that corporations should stick their nose out of it just so there's a sort of neutrality to the way that they intervene into public discourse?
It's difficult when a corporation should be bigger than an individual, except in the case when it's that individual that has, you know, their name is on the brand and their entire life history is part of that brand. They might, and there's always that case of, you know, founder syndrome where someone thinks they are bigger than the company and they certainly will use their platform to push a personal agenda, which can be a political agenda. So that is problematic. As Toby mentioned earlier, you know, there is the issue of like, how does your action impact your employees in that particular moment? And I think in the Georgia case, decisions were made because, yeah, sure, the impact against these very constricting voting laws is going to negatively impact their capacity to vote potentially in the long term. But by fully withdrawing from your presence in the state, what's the collateral damage in the greater, you know, in the greater scheme of things? So it's a difficult balance between making a moral stand, but also weighing out the costs of such an action that you can't control. And it's a dicey thing. I think making a position is important. Calling it out, naming it, and standing behind your word is essential. Whether that equates to physically, you know, an act that's going to result in job losses is another argument altogether.
Patricia, can I make a very quick point? Large corporations have large budgets. Individuals don't. If the trend of corporations speaking out and expressing their views on social issues continues, they will dwarf the views of people. And corporations really will inform our social policy, and they'll tend to be populist as well. I think it's a really dangerous trend.
And can I also add a point to that? Because of course, corporations can see a financial value to taking a stance on these issues when you're so-called virtue signalling to increase your brand popularity and your sales. Then does it actually diminish the value of that cause in some moral sense?
Well, we're seeing...
Sorry, you take Nike, who made such a fuss about Black Lives Matter, while simultaneously they were listed on a name of 83 corporations that were linked to forced labour of Uyghurs. You know, what's going on there?
Yeah, well, when there are contradictions, they should be called out for sure. I want to bring you in, Adam, because the reason we're talking about this is we're having this, you know, discussion, of course, about what's happening in the United States. Will Smith's slavery film, Emancipation, has pulled out of Georgia over the voting laws. In that case, it's kind of, it's a corporation, he's making money. But he's a celebrity. It's a celebrity taking a stand too. You're our celebrity here. Is that a good use of his political muscle to pull out of Georgia to make a point that, I mean, he's a black man and he's raising his voice and his social power to say that obviously disenfranchising people of colour is the wrong thing to do?
I think it comes down to whether or not you want to make a point or whether you want to, you know, keep your business going. I mean, the point was made that Gillette lost money in the next quarter, but my question would be, was the boss of Gillette worried? Was he like, well, that was a bad marketing strategy? Or did he go, I don't care that we took the hit because we made a point, we made a moral point? I think there comes a time where, you know, if you're Will Smith and you're filming in Georgia and Georgia have just introduced laws that make it harder for black people to vote, I'd like to think you don't even you don't even tally up, well, what's this going to cost? You go, do you know what? There's a point to be made here and I need to make a point, and it's as simple as that. And, you know, that's because I'm an idealist. I'm a comedian. I think you should just say what you feel and you should say, you know, what comes from your heart. And damn the business costs.
Damn! And just to make a sort of check on something, if we can, Adam, you are woke? Do you identify as woke?
Listen, I don't know what woke is.
No, that's
woke is
a
word that has been applied to things. Oh, no, I understand what woke is defined as right now.
Yeah. I had to.
And I
about
understand
5 years
that
ago,
people
someone called me woke, and I had to Google it just to check if I was woke, and then I was very confused.
Yeah, look, I like to do what I think is right by other people, and what I think is fair for people. I don't know if that's woke. Woke is now so loaded; it's being used as an attack word. By people who want to keep certain ideas at bay, and it's also being touted by people who want to push other ideas, and it's just become such a loaded word that I just think, be nice.
Can I just say on that?
Yeah, just be nice. COVID-safe hugs for everyone. Tasneem?
Yeah, Patricia, I just want to say on the way that we've weaponised the word woke, and I think Mitch McConnell used the term the left signalling woke people or something to denigrate any move that was against them. I just want to point out the gross hypocrisy of political movements that want to poo-poo these corporations who when they sort of step out of line or stay out of the lane that is pro-conservatism, suddenly they become the arch enemy. And they, until that point, they're happy to receive their money. They're happy to live off the ticket of a corporate agenda and have been, for centuries or for decades at least in the US. But suddenly, when these same corporations say, look, this is a line too far, you can't do this. It's suddenly, oh no, you're left signalling woke, sellouts or something. So there's a massive hypocrisy in this conversation that I think needs to be called out as well.
Oh, well, we've called it out here, or you have. Now, while a global pandemic has been no laughing matter, there's perhaps no better time for a bit of comedic relief. Last year, the Melbourne Comedy Festival was cancelled. It was very sad. Many lost work and postponed shows. And now stages are open and they've been bringing much-needed laughs to Victorians, and we've needed them. And while many shows at this year's festival were sellouts, venues were forced to operate below capacity. But from next week, they'll be able to fill every seat. The Sydney Comedy Festival is now getting underway, and 3 comedians sat down with the drums, Stephanie Bolci, to talk about what COVID has meant for their gigs.
I want all of us to feel like we're here together and it's good to be here. It's good to be anywhere. Well done. Freeze frame there, the dates come up.
Silly, crazy, 2 girls going off.
I don't know, if you know my other stuff, you'll enjoy this. It's the same kind of garbage.
I'm Lauren Bonner. I just did the Melbourne Comedy Festival with a show called Heartbreaker, but that is done now. And so I'm coming to Sydney Comedy Festival with a split comedy show with Conchetta Caristo. It's called Big Natural Talent.
I bought a lobster costume at the end of 2019 and decided that I was going to only do stand-up dressed as a giant lobster. But unfortunately, audiences weren't quite ready for it. Obviously then COVID happened, all of shows last year were cancelled, so then this year I was like, I'll just do the lobster show. Then as I reflected more upon the year that everyone had last year, I was like, no one cares about your lobster show. You can't do a lobster show. But by that point, I'd already written the blurb. I don't sit down to write with a theme in mind, but I did look back at all of my material over the last year and went, there seems to be a common thread here, and it seems to be about staying alive, basically, and what we do to stay alive. I wonder why I was thinking about that.
And what are some of the things that you did to stay alive in 2020?
I got a dog, and she brought me a lot of joy. I started socialising more over Zoom. I started thinking about having children. But then I got the dog instead.
I just moved in with my boyfriend, so I think there might be a few things about that. I've got a pretty interesting family. Like my brother's a minister, my dad's an alcoholic, so it's just a potent mix.
My name's Michael Hing, and my show at the Comedy Festival this year is called Kill Hing in the Name of.
sum that up in one sentence?
Last year, in the depths of COVID, none of us were doing well, and I tried to fake my own death, and this is that story. And again, I understand this is not okay, but I was like, if I fake my death, then everyone will just think I'm dead. I can not do my job, and I won't have to be stressed out about it. It had kind of just been a joke with my friends, but then there came a time where I was like, no, I'm going to do it. Yeah, and I obviously didn't, unless, you know, this is not me, and I've double faked.
The Melbourne Comedy Festival is kind of, in a comedian's ear, like the big thing, and so for it to be cancelled seemed like completely just never going to happen. And then it happened, and so it was like, oh.
I don't know what the other comics have told you, but I'm going to tell you the truth, and that is that we were all mildly relieved to not have to do any shows for the Melbourne Comedy Festival because it just meant we got a little bit of time off. But then after a few months of kind of being in lockdown and having no gigs, we all started really missing it and going crazy.
I got onto Centrelink like straight away, beat the queue, and that was amazing. They're going to have a hard time getting me off.
I actually probably don't need to promote the show, to be honest. It's probably all sold out, or close to, I don't know.
Everyone in the audience is just so ready to see someone perform again and to laugh, and every comedian had a whole new attitude and a fresh, perspective on the world.
Delightful. Adam, I want to start with you for obvious reasons. You had to pause your show a year ago, and not come and perform it just as you were, I think, getting your mojo. Press pause, a year later, bring it back out. Is that hard, working with the same material? Have you had to revisit it?
Some of it has changed. The hardest bit for me was just getting back on stage. I did a trial show back here in Melbourne, and I sat on the front of the stage and was freaked out by being in a room with 35 people. And it didn't occur to me till afterwards. They were probably as freaked out as I am. So I've now started my show every night by just saying to the crowd, if you're worried, if it's a bit weird, don't worry. It's weird for all of us. Because the show's in Melbourne and I went through the Melbourne lockdown, there's an easy bond with all of them because I found that people in Melbourne refer to lockdown much like, they talk about it the way Vietnam War veterans talk about the war. They're like, you weren't there, man, you don't know what we went through. So, and in that instance, suddenly comedy serves its purpose because it unites everyone and it brings the whole audience together. So yes, it's been strange, but it's been strange for audiences as much as comedians. Yeah, OK, I love the way you just framed that because you've just hit a very massive nail on the head. That is exactly what Melbourne people do. And there is a lot of, you've channeled my feelings, there's a lot of grumpiness. Like when my Sydney friends are like, we went through lockdown too, I feel rage. Do you feel... You don't know what it was like. Yeah. You don't know what it was like to get to 5 to 8 at night and realise you've run out of milk and panic because you can't make it to Coles and back before the curfew starts. You weren't there, man. Because it's quite an intense feeling. So that kind of gets you on the side of obviously the audience because you've all been, in the trenches together, which is a special thing, Adam. But have you had to think about how much you rely on COVID humour as well? Like I've spoken to other friends who are comedians who say it's a fine line between pleasure and pain. You can't have a zillion shows that just reference COVID. Like we're going to go nuts. Absolutely, and I talk about it for a little bit, and there is that moment in the crowd where I'll say, who's from interstate? And there used to be a time where you'd go, where are you from, sir? And they'd say Brisbane, and there'd be a cheer, and then you go, where are you from? And they'd say England, and they'd be like, ooh. Now, it's where are you from? England. And the next question has to be, how long have you been here? 3 years, hooray! Like if it was 3 days, then people start getting suspicious. And then you look at this person, where are you from? Queensland, and then there's a, ooh. So the whole dynamic of the audience has completely changed now. Yeah, and I suppose, you won't accept heckling from people not wearing masks. I mean, you have to mask shame people too in Melbourne. There's a real mask culture in Melbourne. The masks are off now and the venues are back to 100%, but there are still some people with masks on and you've just kind of got to remember that everyone's still adjusting to it. This is their first time back out in amongst people. Do some jokes that you originally planned to deliver, some of these not work anymore we're not post-pandemic, but, a year into the pandemic? The only thing that I find slightly different, so my show was about like maintaining a positive attitude and a calm head at all times. So that kind of still, you know, applies in a post-COVID world. The weird bit is I had stories about travelling with my wife and kids in Mexico or in London or in Tokyo. And now when I tell those stories, I feel like I'm apologising. I feel like I'm going, I'm really sorry to bring up international travel. I'm sorry that I even did it once. I know we can't do it anymore, but I apologise. So that's the only thing that's weird for me.
So most of your show's full of apologies, right?
Yeah, in many ways.
What's it like? I mean, you mentioned that it sounds like you were in fetal position on the stage, freaking out that there were people near you. Okay, that's the scary bit. But are you also sort of feeling that sort of sense of adrenaline about the idea of a full room?
Absolutely. So when lockdown first hit in Melbourne, there were a bunch of shows that my managers put on where I hosted 3 or 4 different comedians. We were only allowed to have 12 people in the audience, but we had about 200 or 300 on Zoom. And every comedian turned up with the same attitude. And the attitude was, do you know what? I've been all right. I haven't really missed this. I'm kind of okay. Until they got that first laugh and you could see them go, oh my God, I've really missed this. Oh, thank God I get a chance to do this. You kind of forget what that feeling is like to get a laugh from a room full of people. But once you get it back again, the addiction starts up again. So but it's been so necessary for audiences as well. People haven't laughed in a room full of people for ages. So it's a real release for them at the moment, I think.
Yeah, collective laughter is better than just laughing on your own, sadly. Look, I suppose you mentioned it just there, Adam, like the idea of, you're from the UK, but now that's not the case unless they've been here for a while. The word international in the International Melbourne Comedy Festival is kind of key. Yes, full capacity in Melbourne, but Tasneen, that's still not quite right, is it? Because the arts industry, it relies on people being able to actually travel, to go and see these things. Some people are reluctant still to be in rooms, particularly in Melbourne, with lots of people. We know the industry is struggling. Is it getting enough support?
Short answer, no. And I think that's a combination of maybe how the arts are still regarded, at some level by those with the funds. But it's a real shame because during COVID is probably when we needed the arts most as a community. And I speak as a Melburnian here. When you were hurting from the lockdown, from isolation, and you needed that laugh, you needed to be inspired by humour or poetry or art or film or whatever it was, whatever the medium was that could actually, help you reconnect with what was or what could be. That's what the arts do. They provide that vital space to reconnect and to recover. And so to know that was diminished and access to that and funding to that artists themselves as an entity had more trouble than other sectors in the country of accessing JobKeeper, for example, it was a real kick in the guts for the entire community.
Jackie, has the arts industry been shortchanged?
I feel as though there's a growing recognition from the government that the arts sector, whatever that may be, performing arts, creative arts, visual arts, is that recognition that it's important is growing. And I hope it's a
very diplomatic answer.
Well, I hope it's not too late. I see venues around Sydney closing, unfortunately. But I'm also buying tickets to gigs. I've got my tickets to the Sydney Comedy Festival that's coming up. I see my friends really willing to be out and about more than ever. As has been said, people are keen to be around one another, to be laughing, and we just have to put ourselves out there. We have to support the arts as much as possible as individuals, show the government how important it is to have that cultural connection and continue to make the case for greater funding wherever that may be.
Laughter, humanity, identity, it's actually who we are. Toby, has the government failed artists?
To a degree. Look, I mean, take live music, right? $1 billion industry, employs 43,000 people in Australia. During the COVID year, that fell by 91%. So it became a tiny industry. And what the government did was said, OK, well, let's get some money. They put, I think, 350 million or something like that into a fund that can be accessed. But it tends to go to small projects. Those 43,000 jobs won't come back with small projects. I think what they need to do is find a big big operator, you know, Frontier Touring, one of the market leaders who can change everything and say, what can we do to get those jobs happening, to get crowds out, to really kickstart this industry and make it happen. That's where I hope those funds will be applied. Don't seem to have been done so far, but I hope somebody picks up the phone to somebody and sorts that out.
That's interesting. It's interesting that you make that comment because it was a $600 million package that was announced fairly recently. And sometimes the criticism from the arts sector is that the money does go to those big organisations and forgets the little guys. So there was always going to be that balance between how effective the money is and where it's used.
Yeah. Ultimately, this is about getting jobs for painters, not just hairy blokes with guitars. You know, painters and set builders, and about hotel rooms and car rental and flights and a whole lot of flow-on things. That's what it's about.
Not that there's anything wrong with hairy guys with guitars. Okay, some of my best friends, hairy guys with guitars. Adam, returning to you. Obviously, you know, the world has changed really fundamentally here. We're in a little bubble in many ways in Australia because you're able to deliver, you know, your show in a really safe space, right, with very low risk of infection. When you look at those images of people, you know, in London, in Soho, going hard on the beers, they're out on the beers just like the Premier of Victoria famously talked about, but not vaccinated yet. Does it alarm you?
A little, but I mean, you've got to remember that things have changed in different places constantly. I remember being in Melbourne last year in August and everyone in England was out travelling around Europe having a great old life and they couldn't believe that we were locked down. And now we're coming into some sort of freedom. They're slowly emerging into the world. I don't know that it alarms me so much because, like I said earlier on, from what I can tell, the cases, the daily cases are still quite high in the UK, but the daily deaths are ridiculously low because they have managed to vaccinate. Like if I was in the UK right now, I would have had my jab. I missed it by 2 days. My second day of quarantine, I got a text from my UK GP going, hey, come on in and get your jab. So yes, it's alarming to see them all getting out on the beers, but it is also comforting to know that so many people in the UK have had the jab at the moment. Yeah. And going back to what was also just said about, you know, I kind of feel the same way that a lot of the funding needs to go to a lot of the grassroots. Maybe there's a balance between the big companies and the grassroots because, yes, I completely agree that we need to pay the carpenters and we need to pay all the people that work behind the sets. But if you don't help out the hairy guy on the guitar, he's not going to be touring for Frontier Touring Company in years to come. Yeah, so it kind of needs to be a balance there, I think.
Another defence of hairy men. All right, finally today, Muslims across the world began their annual Ramadan fast this week, abstaining from food, water and other indulgences from dawn to dusk. We spoke to 3 regular drum panellists about the questions they're most commonly asked about Ramadan.
The typical questions around Ramadan is like, even water? I'm like, yes, even water. You can't have a sip of water.
Not even water. That's number one.
Oh, no water. No water.
No food. No drinks, no sex, no smoking. You've got to be careful not to swear.
People are curious about the timings as well.
How can you wake up so early in the morning?
Another common question is, do children have to do it as well? Yes and no. So once they reach the age of puberty / maturity and they're ready.
I think the third most common question is, you know, which I guess I get a lot is, how do you go through your day without food and water? And, you know, the answer to that is very simple. For the first few days, it's difficult.
Hey, Yusra, yeah?
Let's go iftar.
Let's go iftar? Come on, let's go to iftar.
This Ramadan is very different than the last Ramadan, for sure.
I look forward to having more of these iftars, not just with my family, but also with my friends, because last year we were also isolated from one another.
Very much more than anything else, this Ramadan is very much about family.
My eldest son, Jibril, was in lockdown last year in Melbourne, so he didn't actually spend Ramadan with us. And this year he's home with us.
2020 was kind of a wake-up call how fragile the world is, how fragile the humanity is, and how simple things which we take for granted can be taken away from us because of something which we can't even see.
Got Ramadan staples.
I think this year compared to last year is I think, a symbol of human resilience.
I look forward to the month of Ramadan every year. For me, it is a time to sort of pause, reflect, and appreciate every moment that we have by allowing my body to rest a little bit. It's just sort of a time to realign with my purpose and values.
I love it. It's one of my most favourite times of the year in like my entire life. So I feel really, really fortunate to have Ramadan. We don't know if we'll live to see another Ramadan, so we just have to be really grateful in this moment and get the most that we can out of this experience.
Tasneem, you're on the cusp of breaking your fast. What are you going to eat?
At this stage, something I pick up from the train station. nothing too glamorous on the way home. But typically it would be dates and water.
Yes, dates and water. Yeah, you must be dehydrated by the end of the day. Thank you to all of you. You've been such a wonderful panel. Thank you so much. And that's all we've got time for tonight. Jackie Munro, Toby Ralph, Adam Hills and Tasneem Chopra joining us. Have an excellent evening. Ellen and Julia will be back with you next week. I'm Patricia Carvelis. It's been great to have your company. Have a great weekend.
Hello, straight after the news, it's Gardening Australia. We have formal native gardens, share the beauty of bromeliads and meet some